Okay. Day 7, right? Yeah. We this whole day was about availability, business kind of, keeping your business functioning. Not only keeping it functioning, but looking at ways to improve it. We talked about loss of services, being some natural disaster can cause that. How well businesses adjust to change. You can measure that 5 nines. Our services up 99.999% of the time. That would be down less than 6 minutes a year. How we can manage that: no single point of failure, resiliency developed through fault tolerance. And we'll talk a little more about that later on. We talk about asset management, people, data, hardware, and software, and how you classify those in order to look at which parts are crucial or less crucial in terms of managing assets. We looked at grade trunk system we're going to do at NIAC with the students in the fall. We talked about connections into the internet, like multi-homed, where you have 2 connections in, maybe with 2 different providers. NIAC just connects to the ICN. And we looked at redundancy. We had some multi-layered switches, layer 2 switches. We talked about connections like this. And then later on we talk about how do we manage loops and so forth in there. Access layer, how do we get into the network? How do we distribute the information in the network? And the core layer. It might be a WAN or just might be communications where we're transferring from one area to another. Like from one department to another department, or from one location to another location. I talked about the example we were talking about. This was an example where Win95 was first put out. You could register online, and what they were doing, they were grabbing all the software in your computer and taking a look at it. I guess we were talking about what things get access to and which ones not. We talked about identifying threats, and are you vulnerable? Is there a threat agent and so forth? We talked about those before. Doing a risk analysis. Are we at risk? And then how do we mitigate that? And we're going to talk more about those options later on. We mentioned this idea. Data and information is available nowadays. Most people can access data and get information. It's what you do with that makes a difference. Defense in depth, the students did a little research. We talked about layered. We talked about limiting what people can access, making information that's not obvious, obscure it, different types of access. Keep it simple, especially on the inside, maybe more complex looking outside. There is physical access, limiting that. Some of the things we talked about, like authentication, we talked about devices, firewalls, PIN numbers, biometric type things, something you have, knowing a password, a key, a security key, security questions. Mentioned single sign-on a little bit. Multi-factor, ways of accessing information and securing it. We looked at one other thing too. It's possible to make security so complex that now it's not usable. So you have to find the combination that works best. And an example, somebody talking about internal being simple. I'm not going to go over it here, but I did talk a little bit here. If you're wondering if you remember what this was, we talked about different drives, couple floppy drives, hard drive, and then a network drive. And at the college, I have an iDrive. And we talked about it's called the common drive is the name, and they give it a letter. And so when faculty had to go home and do their work, they were concerned about their files that were here. One thing they talked about, you could move them to OneDrive, the Microsoft product, or they set up VPNs for the faculty. How do we improve high availability? We can use redundancy within devices. We talked about RAID in terms of hard drives. Holding information that then if one drive fails, you don't lose anything. We talked about switching and spanning tree protocol. We went over a little bit of that right here. The idea you can have switches like this, and then you're worried about traffic moving in a loop, going to here, then up to here, then maybe back down to here, so you get a loop. Spanning tree is a method to help us avoid that. Okay, so talked a little bit about VLANs and root bridges. We actually, a lot of this information is in the networking class in June. We talked about you can have a virtual default gateway, so your PCs are all pointing at the virtual gateway, and so if one router goes down, everything gets switched to the other router and vice versa. Hot standby. Okay. We also talk about, and this is the router redundancy protocol, virtual router redundancy protocol. And then we talk about load balancing, the ability to separate traffic. Some traffic takes one route, and some traffic takes another route. This can get a lot more detailed, but we'll talk more about that later on. It's like some institutions are multi-home. They have two different connections to the internet. They can split traffic up. Actually, one conversation can be split up, and those packets could be sent in from two different ISPs. They can balance the load. Talked a little bit about multi-locations, having it set up, some running hot where the main location and you have another site and they run synchronous. They're exchanging information all the time, so this one could always take over for this one, the main location. Asynchronous, same concept except not real time, not keeping up necessarily real time. And then you could have a situation where you have another location, and if one location goes down, you can switch to that location. Okay, finish up with, we talked about resiliency within a business in order to be able to keep business functioning. You can do that with fault tolerance. You can do that with, we talked about good backups, for example, on the Linux project. So, you want to be able to maintain the business functioning. That would be resiliency. And you can do that with lots of redundancy within your company. And having good policies and plans in place so when things do change, you can make the adjustments. When an incident happens, you need to figure out a way to report it. You get legal involved. You must have a chain of authority in your company. Who reports to who when we have a situation. Your policies should have you prepared if something goes wrong. You have to have a way to detect and analyze it. We talked a little bit about intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems. You have to have a way to contain, eradicate, and recovery, crew, true, and that's really important to keep system resiliency and keep the company continuity going. And then the follow-up. How do you manage after the incident? Talked a little bit about network access. Cisco calls it network admission control. Most generically would call that network access control. How do you control access into the network? And then the last thing we talked about, disaster recovery. You need to have a plan, things to think about. Do you have your configurations backed up? Do you have a way to communicate if the current regular communications is down? How do you manage power? What dependencies, what things are the key dependencies that have to be functioning? And you might have to do some work manually. People got to be able to adjust manually. And all this would be laid out in some type of policy. All right, that's it for today.